essentially it's about monitoring pollutants associated with acid deposition. So all they're monitoring here now are some of the acid, gases and aerosols. And they're also monitoring ammonia, and ammonia is not acid, it's an alkali, but it can be involved in acidification. So at the moment, the main centre of action in terms of air pollution monitoring here, believe it or not, is that bluey-green toolbox that's strapped to a pole. Okay, and that is for monitoring ammonia and nitric acid. So monitoring of ammonia and nitric acid started here in 1996. Because actually for a long time there was very little monitoring of either of those, and yet they're both significantly important in understanding the nitrogen budget in terms of atmospheric emissions and deposition. And there's still some work going on for SO2, although this is there used to be a national network for SO2, a rural network, which again there was on that green stick that sticks out of that metal box, porta cabin thing. That was where the intake for the SO2, but that network was expanded in 2005. One of the reasons they disbanded the rural SO2 network was because concentrations had got so low that they were actually proving rather difficult to detect. So the instrumentation you needed to measure the available concentrations was getting really quite expensive to run. So the old methods, the cheap methods, were no longer viable. So a lot of stations were recording below detection. Even somewhere like this where you're near a power station, and occasionally still the power station plume will come down through a thing called plume grounding. But even here the concentrations were 5 ppm or less. Once it gets below about 2 or 3 ppm, it becomes increasingly difficult to monitor. So now we're down to a really rather restricted range of measurements. And given the way that the national networks have fragmented, I think when we had the talks on air pollution, I pointed you towards the air quality website, but actually none of this data are available through that. You have to go through the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology website. You can get it, but you just need to know where to look. So pollutants related to health effects specifically are still available through the air quality website. If you're interested in pollutants associated with acidification or eutrophication, so in other words nutrient inputs from the atmosphere, then you have to go through the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology website. So it's a bit messy because they're not very well tied together, but the data is still there. So as I say, really not that much going on anymore, but it comes and goes depending on fashion, funding, whichever pollutant is the flavour of the year or something. So that's where we are now here anyway.
Just looking at that box, you can tell it's measuring air samples because the funnel is turning down. If you have funnel pointing up, you're measuring rainfall. And at times in the past, again, you've had, and possibly even now, these things may be being monitored for atmospheric chemistry, for water chemistry. But if you've got a funnel pointing downwards, you know it's trying to keep out the rain and taking in the atmosphere.
Birds.
Yeah, birds.
Yeah.
Well, insects fly from them. Yeah. I think we're just about done. So, any more questions? Why are we here? So made, particularly environmental measurements, are inevitably some kind of compromise. And if you're going to be using environmental data for any purpose, you really ought to have some sort of understanding of what sort of processes are involved in getting those data. And so that's essentially why you're here.
And it's exactly the same with the air quality data. You know, measurements start, measurements stop, they change instrumentation, they move around. Now this is quite unusual in that at least here they've got all the metadata to go with the air pollution measurements. At most places where they measure air quality, or lots of sites, they don't collect the metadata as well, which you might think was a fairly basic thing to do. And they don't co-locate measurements of pollutants that you really need to understand how they work together. So a lot of sites historically have just measured one or a particular group of pollutants and not measured the pollutants you need to understand about how they're interacting. So for example, ammonia. For a a long time there was no national network for ammonia monitoring, and yet because ammonia is an alkali gas, it's really important the way it interacts with the acid gases such as sulfur dioxide, to some extent with NO2. And it's only by measuring them together that you can really get a picture of what's going on in the atmosphere, and that doesn't happen as often as it should do. So there's been a move towards sites which have more measurements going on, higher resolution data sets in terms of the temporal resolution. But there is a downside of that, of course, is you can afford to run fewer of those sites because they're increasingly expensive. And so there's always a choice to be made, a compromise to be made between the spatial resolution of your network and the number of pollutants and the temporal resolution of the data that you can collect. As I say, as priorities shift around, as you put more and more money into monitoring in urban areas because of concerns about pollution and health, for example, so the number of sites in rural areas has tended to go down.
Is this going to be on the exam?
Ah, could be. It's certainly not precluded from being on the exam, okay? But I'm not giving any clues away one way or the other, okay?
But issues about sampling and things like that are important, and they come into all sorts of aspects of the course. So we can see the relevance of it across the board, I hope.
Yes. It's relevant to the learning outcomes.
Absolutely.
Okay, back on the bus.
Oh, double. What's it you think?
Yeah, I like every single time anyway.
This is so clever. Oh, thanks. I was like, I didn't say it. I didn't say
Your two rooms.
I'm definitely doing one. I don't think you actually go, but it's on the clouds, and then you actually go. Yeah, that's what Paul said, I was like, you never go out. Who are that one play boys and girls? But you have to do but it's not my I like looking at through a window.